May 8th, 1945. In a Berlin cellar still reeking of cordite and plaster dust, a woman whose name has been lost to history heard the news and wrote in her diary, "So that's it, the end. Germany has capitulated unconditionally." She paused, her pencil hovering over the page, then added what thousands of her countrymen were thinking but few would admit. "I feel nothing. No pain, no joy, no fear. Just a vast emptiness where feelings used to be." Across Germany that evening, as Admiral Karl Dönitz's voice crackled through radio speakers announcing the surrender that had been signed the previous day in Reims, 70 million people confronted the end of everything they had known. Their reactions, documented in diaries, letters, and Allied intelligence reports, reveal not a single German response to defeat, but dozens of them, contradictory and complex, shaped by what each person had lost, what they had believed, and what they now faced in the ruins. In Hamburg, where 73% of the city's housing had been destroyed by bombing, a 42-year-old schoolteacher named Mathilde Wolf-Munkeberg heard the announcement and felt what she described as an enormous weightlifting. She had spent 3 years living in constant terror of the air raid sirens, had watched her neighborhood burn during Operation Gomorrah in 1943, had lost her brother on the Eastern Front and her son-in-law in France. When Dönitz's voice faded and the radio went silent, she walked to her window, looked out at the moonlit rubble that had once been streets of elegant townhouses, and wept. Not from despair, she would later explain, but from relief so profound it felt like physical pain leaving her body. "The bombs won't fall tonight," she wrote, "or tomorrow night, or ever again. Whatever else happens, that alone is worth everything." But 30 kilometers away, in a village that had been largely untouched by bombing, a different reaction unfolded. A farmer in his 50s, a party member since 1933, heard the news and smashed his radio with a hammer. His wife, terrified by his rage, watched as he stormed through their house, tearing down every picture of Hitler, every party banner, every symbol of the regime he had believed in for 12 years. "They lied," he kept repeating. "They lied about everything." His anger was not at the Allies, not at the war's outcome, but at the men who had promised him that Germany could never lose, that final victory was certain, that one more sacrifice would turn the tide. The depth of his fury came from the depth of his belief, now revealed as hollow. In Dresden, Victor Klemperer, a Jewish philologist who had survived the war in hiding, heard the news with emotions so tangled he could barely parse them. Relief that he had survived. Grief for the tens of thousands of German Jews who had not. Vindication that the regime that had stripped him of his professorship, his home, his dignity, had finally fallen. But also, unexpectedly, a kind of sorrow for Germany itself, the Germany of Goethe and Schiller that had been destroyed by the Germany of Hitler and Himmler. "I am free," he wrote in his diary. "But I feel no joy, only exhaustion and a terrible uncertainty about what comes next." The uncertainty was universal. In Munich, where American forces had occupied the city on April 30th, a housewife named Inge Deutsch-Krohn recorded in her diary the conversations she overheard in the bread queue the morning after the surrender. "What will they do to us?" one woman asked. "Will they starve us, shoot us, send us to camps like we did to them?" The fear was palpable and, for many Germans, entirely new. They had spent years hearing propaganda about the brutality of the Bolsheviks, the vengefulness of the Jews, the barbarism of the Allies. Now those enemies were in control, and the propaganda that had sustained German morale had become a source of terror. A 17-year-old boy in Frankfurt, interviewed by American intelligence officers 3 days after the surrender, spoke with a kind of dazed bewilderment. He had been drafted into the Volkssturm in March, given 5 days of training and an old French rifle, and sent to defend a bridge that American tanks had crossed in less than an hour. "They told us we were the master race," he said. "They told us we couldn't lose. They told us the enemy was weak and cowardly." He gestured at the American jeeps rolling past, at the well-fed soldiers, at the endless columns of supplies. Does that look weak to you? The collapse of propaganda was, for many Germans, as disorienting as the collapse of the military. A woman in Cologne told British occupation officials that when she heard the surrender announcement, her first thought was that it must be enemy propaganda, a trick to make them give up. She had believed, truly believed, in the Wunderwaffen that would turn the war around, in the secret negotiations that would split the Allies, in the possibility that Germany could still achieve an acceptable peace. The idea that it was simply over, that Germany had been completely defeated, seemed impossible to process. In Berlin, where Soviet forces had been in control for 8 days, the announcement was almost anticlimactic. A woman who had survived the battle for the city wrote, "Surrender. We surrendered when the first Russian tank appeared on our street. The radio announcement changes nothing. We are already living in defeat." For Berliners, the abstract concept of surrender had been made brutally concrete by the house-to-house fighting, the mass rapes, the summary executions, the complete breakdown of civil order. The official announcement was merely paperwork, confirming what they already knew in their bones. But even in Berlin, reactions varied. A 58-year-old doctor, interviewed by Soviet intelligence officers, expressed something close to satisfaction. He had opposed Hitler. From the beginning, had been briefly imprisoned in 1934 for speaking against the regime, had watched in horror as Germany descended into barbarism. "This had to happen," he said. "We brought this on ourselves. The only tragedy is that it took so long and cost so much." His reaction was rare but not unique. In every German city, there were people who had never believed, who had watched the rise of Nazism with dread, who saw the surrender not as a catastrophe, but as a necessary reckoning. In rural Bavaria, where American forces had met little resistance, a different pattern emerged. A farmer interviewed by a U.S. Army captain expressed neither grief nor relief, but a kind of pragmatic acceptance. The war was over. The Nazis were gone. Now there was work to do, fields to plant, animals to tend, a farm to keep running. Politics had never much interested him. He had joined the party because everyone did, had sent his son to war because he had to, had hung Hitler's picture in his kitchen because not doing so would have caused problems. Now Hitler was dead, the war was lost, and life would continue in some form. "We'll manage," he said with a shrug. "We always do." This rural apathy, documented across southern Germany, reflected a population that had been less touched by the war's extremes. They had not experienced the saturation bombing of the cities. They had not been caught in the grinding urban combat. Many had never seen an enemy soldier until the Americans or French arrived, often without firing a shot. For them, the surrender was less a cataclysm than an inconvenience, a disruption to the rhythms of agricultural life that would eventually sort itself out. But even this apathy had its limits. When a group of farmers in a village near Nuremberg were shown footage of Bergen-Belsen concentration camp by American soldiers, their reactions were documented in a military government report. Some refused to believe it was real, insisting it must be propaganda. Others watched in stunned silence, then walked away without speaking. One man, a party member who had farmed the same land for 30 years, watched the entire film, then sat down on a bench and put his head in his hands. "We didn't know," he kept saying. "We didn't know." Whether this was true or a convenient lie varied from person to person, but the shock of seeing the evidence was, in many cases, genuine. In the industrial cities of the Ruhr, where British forces had taken control in April, the surrender brought a different kind of relief. A steel worker in Essen, interviewed by British intelligence, spoke of the exhaustion that had become total. He had worked 12-hour shifts 7 days a week for 3 years. He had survived bombing raids that killed his neighbors. He had seen his factory destroyed and rebuilt and destroyed again. He had eaten rations that barely sustained life. "I don't care who won," he said. "I don't care what happens next. I just want to sleep. I want to sleep for a week and not hear sirens and not go to the factory and not be afraid." His voice, the interviewer noted, was completely flat, devoid of emotion. He had nothing left to feel with. This exhaustion was perhaps the most common reaction documented across Germany in May 1945. A nation that had been at war for 5 years and 9 months, that had been bombed systematically for 3 years, that had mobilized every resource and every person for total war, had simply used up its capacity for strong emotion. The surrender was not a dramatic climax, but a final confirmation of what most Germans had known for months: that the war was lost, that the suffering had been for nothing, that the future was uncertain and probably grim. In the Eastern Territories, where millions of Germans were fleeing the advancing Soviet army, the surrender announcement reached people in refugee columns, in makeshift camps, in train stations packed with desperate humanity. A woman from East Prussia, who had walked 300 kilometers with her 2 children, heard the news in a barn where 200 refugees were sheltering. "Some people cried," she recalled years later. "Some people didn't react at all. I remember thinking, what difference does it make? Surrender or no surrender, we've already lost everything. Our homes are gone. Our families are scattered. We're refugees in our own country." For the millions of displaced Germans, the surrender was an abstraction. Their personal catastrophe had already occurred. In prisoner of war camps, German soldiers heard the news with reactions that ranged from relief to despair to denial. A Wehrmacht officer held by the Americans in France wrote in a letter that was later intercepted and translated, "Part of me is glad it's over. No more fighting, no more dying. But part of me feels we have betrayed something, though I'm no longer sure what. We were told we were fighting for Germany's survival. Now Germany no longer exists as we knew it. What were we fighting for?" This sense of betrayal was particularly acute among younger Germans who had been raised entirely under Nazi rule. A 19-year-old girl in Stuttgart, who had been a fervent member of the Bund Deutscher Mädel, heard the surrender announcement and felt her entire worldview collapse. "Everything I was taught was a lie," she told an American chaplain who was conducting interviews. "They told us the Führer was a genius. They told us we were creating a 1,000-year Reich. They told us we were the future. And now there is no Führer, no Reich, no future. Who am I supposed to be now?" This identity crisis affected millions of young Germans who had known no other system, no other ideology, no other way of understanding the world. The surrender was not just a military defeat, but an existential one, stripping away the framework through which they had understood their place in history. In Hamburg, an elderly couple heard the news and simply held each other. They had lived through World War I, through the chaos of the Weimar Republic, through the rise of Hitler, through this war. They had survived the firebombing that killed 40,000 of their neighbors in a single week. They had lost one son at Stalingrad and another in Normandy. When Dönitz's voice faded from the radio, the husband turned to his wife and said, "At least we lived to see it end." She nodded. They sat in silence for a long time, holding hands, too weary for tears. The generational divide in reactions was stark. Older Germans, who remembered the previous defeat in 1918, often expressed a grim familiarity with catastrophe. They had rebuilt once. Perhaps they could rebuild again. Younger Germans, especially those who had believed deeply in the Nazi promise, often expressed a sense of total disorientation, of not knowing how to proceed in a world where everything they had been taught was revealed as false. In Heidelberg, which had been spared bombing and was occupied by American forces with minimal fighting, a university professor documented the reactions of his colleagues and students. "The intelligentsia are in shock," he wrote. "Not because we didn't know defeat was coming, but because the scale of the catastrophe is now undeniable. Germany is not just defeated, but destroyed. Our cities are rubble. Our economy is shattered. Our reputation is ruined beyond repair. And worst of all, the moral abyss we fell into is being revealed to the world. How do we come back from that? The question of moral responsibility was one that most Germans were not yet ready to confront in May 1945. Survival was too immediate a concern. But for some, the surrender forced a reckoning. A pastor in Munich, who had been part of the confessing church that opposed Hitler, wrote in his diary, "The war is over, but the judgment is just beginning. Not the judgment of the Allies, but the judgment we must pass on ourselves. What did we do? What did we allow? What did we ignore? These questions will haunt us for generations." In the French occupation zone, German civilians encountered yet another dynamic. A woman in Baden-Baden described the French soldiers who arrived in her town as correct but cold. There was no friendliness, no attempt at reconciliation, just a distant professionalism that somehow felt more unsettling than outright hostility. "They look at us like we're contaminated," she wrote, "like we're carriers of some disease they don't want to catch." Maybe we are. The sense of being judged, of being collectively guilty, was something many Germans struggled with. A school teacher in Bremen told British occupation officials, "I never hurt anyone. I never joined the party. I just tried to keep my head down and survive. But now I'm German, and that means I'm guilty of everything Germany did." How is that fair? The officer's response was not recorded, but the question itself reveals the difficulty many ordinary Germans had in accepting collective responsibility for crimes they did not personally commit, but also did not effectively resist. In Berlin's ruins, where the immediate struggle was for survival, such philosophical questions seemed like luxuries. A woman searching through rubble for anything salvageable heard the surrender announcement from a neighbor's working radio and barely paused in her digging. "Surrender, occupation, whatever comes next, it doesn't matter," she said. "What matters is finding something to trade for food. What matters is getting through today." For millions of Germans in the destroyed cities, the surrender was less important than the immediate questions of where to sleep, what to eat, how to survive the next 24 hours. The class divisions that had been temporarily obscured by total war reasserted themselves in reactions to the surrender. Wealthy Germans who had country estates to retreat to, who had savings and connections, often expressed a kind of resigned optimism. They had resources to rebuild. Working-class Germans in the bombed cities, who had lost everything and had no cushion to fall back on, expressed a bleaker outlook. A factory worker in Cologne told British officials, "The rich will be fine. They always are. It's people like us who'll starve." In the countryside of Schleswig-Holstein, where refugees from the east were flooding in by the thousands, the surrender announcement was met with a kind of bitter irony. "The war is over," a refugee woman said, "but for us, the suffering is just beginning. We have no homes, no possessions, no way to support ourselves. And now we're trapped in a defeated country that doesn't want us and can't feed us." The refugee crisis would continue for years, creating tensions between displaced Germans and the communities forced to absorb them. Among former party officials, the reactions were often self-serving. A mid-level Nazi bureaucrat in Frankfurt, interviewed by American intelligence, expressed shock and dismay at Germany's defeat, but carefully avoided any mention of his own role in the regime. "We were misled," he said. "The leadership lied to us. We thought we were building something great." The interviewer's notes indicate skepticism about this claim of ignorance, but it was a narrative that many former Nazis would adopt. They were victims too, deceived by Hitler and his inner circle. In contrast, some Germans expressed a kind of defiant pride even in defeat. A former Wehrmacht officer, captured in the final days of fighting, told his American interrogators, "We lost, but we fought well. No one can say the German soldier didn't do his duty." This attempt to separate military honor from the regime's crimes would become a common theme in post-war Germany, a way of salvaging something from the catastrophe. The surrender also brought practical concerns that varied by region. In areas occupied by the Americans or British, there was cautious optimism that treatment would be relatively humane. In areas occupied by the Soviets, there was deep fear based on reports of what had happened in Berlin and other eastern cities. A woman in Saxony, hearing that her town would be in the Soviet zone, said simply, "God help us." Her fear was not abstract. Reports of mass rape, looting, and arbitrary violence by Soviet troops had spread across Germany, and for millions in the East, the surrender meant not liberation, but a new kind of terror. Yet even in the Soviet zone, reactions varied. Some Germans, particularly communists who had opposed Hitler, welcomed the Soviet arrival as liberation. A former political prisoner in Thuringia, freed from a labor camp by Soviet troops, heard the surrender announcement with genuine joy. "The nightmare is over," he said. "Now we can build something better." His optimism would prove tragically misplaced, but in that moment, he believed in the possibility of renewal. In small towns across Germany, the surrender brought a strange mixture of relief and apprehension. A mayor in Lower Saxony described the moment he heard the news. "I felt like a man who'd been holding his breath underwater and finally broke the surface. I could breathe again, but I also knew that everything was about to change in ways I couldn't predict. My job now was to help my town survive whatever came next." The sense of responsibility, of needing to focus on immediate practical matters, was common among local officials who had to deal with occupation forces, displaced persons, food shortages, and the breakdown of normal governance. For them, the surrender was not an emotional moment, but a practical challenge. Among German children, reactions were filtered through their limited understanding of what war and defeat meant. A 10-year-old boy in Hamburg, interviewed years later, remembered thinking, "Does this mean my father will come home?" His father had been missing on the Eastern Front since 1943 and would never return, but the boy's hope in that moment was simple and heartbreaking. For many German children, the surrender meant primarily the hope of reunification with absent fathers, brothers, and uncles. In the hospitals packed with wounded soldiers, the surrender announcement was met with a mixture of relief and bitterness. A nurse in Munich recorded in her diary, "The men who can understand what's happened are relieved they won't have to go back to fighting. But some of them are angry, feeling their sacrifices were for nothing. And some just stare at the ceiling, too broken to care either way." The question of what the sacrifices had been haunted many Germans. A widow in Nuremberg, who had lost her husband at El Alamein and her son in the Battle of the Bulge, heard the surrender announcement and felt a rage so pure it frightened her. "They died for nothing," she said to her sister. "All of it, all the suffering, all the death, it was for nothing. Worse than nothing, for a madman's delusion." Her anger would eventually give way to grief. But in that moment, it was the only emotion strong enough to break through her numbness. As night fell on May 8th across Germany, millions of people lay in beds or on floors or in cellars, processing the day's news in solitude. Some prayed, some wept, some stared into darkness, too exhausted for either prayer or tears. A diarist in Frankfurt wrote, "The war is over, but I don't feel like celebrating. I don't feel like mourning. I just feel empty and old and tired beyond measure. Tomorrow will come and the day after, and somehow we'll have to figure out how to live in this new world. But tonight, I just want to sleep and not dream." The dreams, when they came, were often of the past, of Germany before the war, before Hitler, before everything went wrong, of homes that no longer existed, of people who would never return, of a country that had destroyed itself and been destroyed in turn, and now faced a future that no one could predict, but everyone feared would be hard beyond imagining. In the days and weeks after the surrender, as the initial shock wore off, Germans would begin the long process of coming to terms with what had happened. But on that night of May 8th, 1945, the dominant emotion across Germany was not any single feeling, but a vast spectrum of human response to catastrophe. Relief, despair, anger, fear, apathy, hope, bitterness, exhaustion, and above all, a sense of standing at the edge of an abyss, looking into an uncertain future, knowing only that everything had changed and nothing would ever be the same.